advisor in the Credit Branch's Engagement and Operations team. And today I'm going to talk to you about three things. Firstly, the recent July changes to the rules relating to affordability assessments. Secondly, the approach that the Commission takes to deciding an enforcement outcome when we identify potential breaches of responsible lending obligations. And lastly, I want to touch on some questions that we've received from lenders around suitability and around affordability assessments. So as you know, it's important that you get your affordability assessments right, because if you don't, you may need to pay borrower back some money, such as the interest and fees you've charged, or civil pecuniary penalties of up to $600,000 per breach. And if the failure is a result of directors and/or senior managers failing to take due care to ensure that your policies and procedures are compliant and that your employees follow them, the directors and/or senior managers may themselves be personally liable for pecuniary penalties. In March this year, the Minister of Commerce and Consumer Affairs, David Clark, announced a number of changes to the affordability regulations and code guidance, and those changes came into force on 7 July. And these changes arose out of the IMB-led review into the implementation of the affordability regulations in December, and were an initial response to address some of the unintended consequences identified by IMB arising from the regulations. And in August, when at the same time as the release of the IMB CCCFA review, the Minister also announced a further set of changes to the proposed changes to the regulations and code. Louise has touched on those a little bit. I won't speak about those, but I will speak a little bit more about the initial changes in July. So as you will all be aware, the responsible lending principles require that lenders make reasonable inquiries before entering into a loan or making a material change to be satisfied that it's likely that the loan is that the borrower can repay the loan without suffering substantial hardship. And since 1 December, lenders also have to comply with the prescriptive affordability regulations. So from July this year, the regulations were amended to explicitly exclude savings and investments from the definition of listed outgoings in the regulations. And this means that you no longer need to include savings and investment payments in your calculation of likely relevant expenses. But remember that where a borrower is saving for a particular expense in respect of the relevant period, for example, rates, that expense itself will still need to be included in the expense assessment, just not the savings for it. The regulations have also been changed to make it clear that the obligation to, quote, to obtain information in sufficient detail to minimise the risk of relevant expenses being missed or underestimated to an extent that is material to the estimate only applies where the initial estimate is based on asking the borrower about their relevant expenses. So in practice, we think this means you'll just need to ensure that you collect expenses from borrowers in sufficient granularity rather than in, say, larger buckets, for example, total debts or total living expenses. There were also extensive changes to the code, which took effect in July. And in our view of these changes and additions are really around expense assessments, is that they largely just reinforce to lenders the flexibility that already existed under the regulations in terms of the different pathways that lenders can take to make their expense assessment. So there's now additional guidance for making stage 1 initial estimate of expenses, as well as the stage 2 verification step. Verification in stage 2, so stage 2 of the assessment of likely relevant expenses requires that you verify expenses where the initial estimate was based on asking the borrower about the expenses, or where there is a significant risk that the initial estimate materially underestimates relevant expenses. So the code now provides additional guidance, including that lenders may use different methods to verify and adjust different types of expenses. So for example, where a lender asks the borrower for their living expenses when making the initial estimate, either lender may choose to compare the benchmarkable expenses against a benchmark and verify the remaining living expenses using statements, or verify all living expenses using statements. Remembering where a lender can't verify the expenses against a benchmark or statements or other reliable information, the lender must compare the expense to a reasonable cost estimate. At the Commission, we have seen instances of lenders endeavouring to verify almost all of the borrower's expenses through benchmarks. We note that not all expenses will be benchmarkable, perhaps particularly some of the borrower's fixed financial commitments, debt payments and regular expenses that the borrower is unwilling to give up. So we would caution lenders against endeavouring to benchmark all expenses in circumstances where bank statements would appear to be more appropriate to verify the borrower's actual expenditure. So the code guidance in relation to the exception in Regulation 4AG has also been substantially revised. So this exception provides that a full affordability assessment does not need to be made where you've made inquiries that are sufficient to establish that it's obvious that the borrower can afford the loan without substantial hardship. So the revised code removes the previous commentary that this is intended to be a high test, and together with the previous example that's gone also, and it replaces these with new guidance, scenarios and examples. So it's important to remember the role of the regulations. That they support the triple CFA and help you comply with it. And I say that because if you want to use the exception in Regulation 4AG, you still have the overarching Section 9C responsible lending obligations. But so what does that mean? That means you still have to meet the criteria of the exception, and you must still exercise the care, diligence and skill of a responsible lender. And every time you use the exception, it will be context specific. But there are some things you might want to keep in mind. For example, the code does have guidance for you on when you may be able to use the exception, but there may be things outside that listed in the code which you should be looking out for. For example, what do you know about the borrower's payment history? The code doesn't say you should take into account what you already know about the borrower and how they tend to pay off their debt, but we think a responsible lender would consider any red flags in their repayment history. Similarly, more generally, what do you know about the borrower's behaviour to date? Do they have a habit of doing what they say they will? If not, a responsible lender may not be able to rely on the obvious exception where the debt is to be repaid with a bonus or commission. That's because a responsible lender may not be able to trust the borrower to do what they say they will do and use that money to repay the loan. Finally, if you're using the obvious exception where you are required to be satisfied that there's a large surplus after expenses have been paid, the code doesn't give guidance on what is a large surplus. I mean, in that case, it will be a surplus which a responsible lender using care, diligence and skill thinks is large. This is not something we can give you any dollar or percentage figure, or as it comes down to what a responsible lender would do in that particular fact-specific scenario. So I'll come back to this when I discuss surpluses later on. I now want to sort of turn to the sorts of things that the Commission thinks about when considering an enforcement outcome when we identify a potential breach of responsible lending affordability obligations. So there are a range of options open to us, starting from taking no further action through to compliance advice and warning letters, through to legal proceedings. And our investigation decisions are made in accordance with our enforcement response guidelines, and these are available on our website. For affordability breaches, when considering what the appropriate enforcement response is, we're mindful of, among other things, the extent of the harm. What was the overall outcome of the affordability assessment despite the breach? Is there any evidence that borrowers suffered substantial hardship? Remembering that just because a borrower hasn't defaulted, it doesn't mean they haven't suffered substantial hardship, because borrowers will typically prioritise their mortgage or car payments and may end up with insufficient funds to cover necessities such as utilities. We look at the total number of borrowers that have been affected and are particularly or more concerned if the borrowers are particularly vulnerable for any reason. For example, English may be a second language for them, or they may have been desperate, particularly desperate for the funds. How serious was the conduct? Did the lender take reasonable steps to do the affordability assessment? Was there no affordability assessment or something in the middle? We would also here caution, ask lenders to be careful in terms of over-reliance on payment history when granting additional credit. Although the regular payment amount may not be increasing, unless one of the exceptions applies in the regulations, you'll still need to conduct a full assessment in accordance with the regulations where a material change is made. We also, when considering how serious the conduct is, we look at things like, well, how soon did the borrower default on the loan? And importantly, is this just a one-off failure, or is there some sort of systemic failure in a pattern? We consider whether the lender identified the failure themselves as part of some sort of internal review process or otherwise. And if the lender did identify the failure themselves, I mean, how did you respond? Did you adjust your processes going forward and remediate appropriately? Was the matter self-reported to the Commission, or did we find out ourselves following receipt of complaint? And how quickly did you fix the failure? And lastly, we sort of take into account wider sort of public interest factors. Are there any mitigating or aggravating features involved? And has the Commission engaged with you previously, particularly on the same issue? I want to cover sort of questions that we've received around interpretation of the Act and the regulations. And while we don't give legal advice and we're unable to provide advice tailored to a specific lender, we do encourage lenders to contact us with any particular challenges with the implementation of the Act and regulations, as these will help inform us about where we can most usefully focus our public guidance, which can assist you to comply. So one question we received following the August 22 update for lenders newsletter was, when our benchmarkable expenses are based on the Statistics New Zealand Household Economic Survey, how often do we need to consider revising the benchmark figures? Can we still rely on the 2019-20 data given the rising inflation? This is a good question. Under the regulations, as part of the stage 2 process, lenders have the option to verify benchmarkable expenses through the use of benchmarks. Under the regulations, an expense is a benchmarkable expense if it individually or as a group of expenses is an expense for which the lender may use statistical information about household expenditure, including utilities, food and groceries and transport expenses, including fuel, WAF, registration, repairs and maintenance. And the regulations also go on to say that statistical information can only be used if it meets the following requirements. Firstly, it must be based on statistical information about an individual or household expense that has been collected and analysed using robust statistical methodology. Secondly, it must be recent. And thirdly, it must be reasonable in circumstances to use the benchmark, including that there must be a low risk that the benchmark will materially be lower than the particular borrower's likely run expenses. So now, in terms of benchmarks like the HES 2019-20 data, we would caution against lenders against blindly following them. What do we mean by that? Well, we think responsible lenders should consider individual benchmark amounts before using them, and that this is consistent with the benchmark requirements I've just mentioned, and these are set out in Regulation 4.8. The things you should consider include, for example, if the benchmarks for food, has the general cost of food risen? We can all say at the moment that's probably a definite yes. So we would expect an increase to food benchmark amounts, which haven't been set as recently as this year, to take that into account. Now, is the benchmark recent enough? I mean, if there's a more recent benchmark, we're probably going to be asking you why you chose not to use that one. If the benchmark is, say, for $100 for something, but from your experience as a lender that it should really be 150, then we would expect you to use the 150. Remembering benchmarks aren't safe havens. And also remember that as part of your verification assessment, you must take the higher of the benchmark or the initial expense estimate. I think it's important for me to tell you that we aren't going to be looking at benchmarks you're using down to the granular dollar. We will look at the whole picture, and whether your benchmark is out by a couple of dollars or $20, it's not something we're likely to hold against you. But if you use 10 benchmarks and they're all out by $20, then that's going to make a bigger impact on the borrower's overall position. So we might look a bit closer at those. The Commission is often asked what it considers a reasonable surplus or buffer to be. Under the regulation, a lender must be satisfied on reasonable grounds that it's likely that the borrower will make payments under the agreement without suffering substantial hardship, because the borrower's likely income exceeds their likely relevant expenses, and there is one or both of the following: a reasonable surplus or reasonable buffers or adjustments included in the expense estimates. And the regulations have included the need for a reasonable surplus buffers to address the risk that income may be overestimated expenses underestimated, or the borrower may incur unexpected expenses. So the reasonable surplus or buffer is not prescribed in the regulations at a specific dollar amount. The Responsible Lending Code does contain guidance about buffers, surpluses, and adjustments, including new guidance from 7 July. If a lender applies buffers or adjustments adequate to address the risks, as just mentioned, you don't also need to apply a reasonable surplus, i.e. it's the total magnitude of the surplus and the buffers across the affordability formula that is relevant. We would also say that if you're using income expense ratios, we recommend lenders be mindful to ensure that any ratio provides for a sufficient surplus in absolute terms for borrowers at lower levels of income. But I mean, you know, the big question, what is a reasonable surplus? Or equally, what is a reasonable buffer? And I'm sure you want us to be able to tell you a dollar amount, a percentage of income, etc., something that you can use across, use every time across your products. However, we're probably just never going to be able to give you that level of certainty. That's because the answer might depend on many things, such as the approach you've taken in your affordability assessment. For example, did you use bank statements, which are potentially more accurate, or did you ask the borrower and verify it via benchmarks, etc.? What other buffers have you included elsewhere in your assessment, for example, to account for potential rises of interest rates on variable rate debt? What was the certainty of the income used by the borrower has? The type of loan product. So, but we do appreciate and understand more guidance on what a reasonable surplus is would be valuable, and buffers would be valuable to lenders. And we can say that we are continuing to work in this space and keeping that in mind. We have a number of open investigations, as well as into responsible lending matters, as well as a couple of monitoring projects over the next financial year. And our hope is that we'll be able to provide some practical examples for you to follow, following those projects. So watch the space and join our newsletter.